much for turning out to our program this morning. I think it's going to be a very interesting program and certainly very timely. A great deal of interest in the issue of NAFTA, potential NAFTA renegotiation, and how this is going to affect and what precedent it might set for our trade agenda going forward. I'm Wendy Cutler. I'm from the Asia Society Policy Institute. I'm honored to be co-chairing this event with Eric Farnsworth from the Council of Americas. Now, many of you in the audience might think, okay, this makes sense for the Council of Americas to chair such an event and host such an event, but why the Asia Society? And that's because, frankly, NAFTA is just not about an agreement between three countries. It's an agreement that affects not only regional trade, but global trade. And the trade and investment ties between NAFTA countries and Asian companies and countries has grown dramatically since the NAFTA was concluded. Also, our Asian trading partners are watching very closely what happens with respect to the NAFTA negotiation, thinking that they may be able to learn some things, particularly with respect to what the new administration may be asking our NAFTA partners to do in a renegotiation. We have two panels today. We'll start soon with the first panel that I will be moderating, and then Eric Farnsworth will be moderating a panel with a group of private sector officials. Allow me to introduce the panel today. The first panel, which I'm really thrilled, we've got a great team here, and I think once we go through the introductions, you will recognize that we're going to have a great discussion. From Mexico and to my right is Ken Smith Ramos. He is the head of the Trade and NAFTA office in the Ministry of the Economy of Mexico. He's been a very strong and articulate advocate of NAFTA, and frankly seems to be on every panel, and not only in Washington, but also around the country, talking about the benefits of NAFTA, but not just for Mexico, but for US, Canada, and Mexico. And from Canada to my left is my longtime friend, Gilles Gauthier. He is the Minister for Economic Affairs at the Canadian Embassy. He has a strong trade background, and I learned by reading his bio, he was a NAFTA negotiator for his government a few years ago, many years ago. We're also very fortunate to have two USTR veterans with us this morning. And I will confess that when I joined USTR, both of them really intimidated me, but no longer.
5 minutes.
To my left is Chip Rowe. He served as the U.S. Deputy Chief Negotiator for NAFTA. He was ouster for North America and Associate General Counsel during his illustrative USTR career. And finally, Warren Maruyama joins us today. He was the former general counsel to USTR during the George W. Bush administration, served at USTR many years previously, and also worked in the White House in the Office of Policy Development from 1989 to 1992, and he's now a partner at Hogan Lovells. So with that, let's go right into our program, and my first question will be for Ken. So Ken, I hope you can share with us your government's perspective on a possible NAFTA renegotiation, how you see such a renegotiation proceeding, what your government may be seeking in such a negotiation, and also how you view the improvements made in TPP, how they might relate to what can be accomplished in a renegotiation.
Thank you very much, Wendy. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this distinguished panel. Jumping right into your question, Mexico's position has been clear, I believe, from the beginning. NAFTA works. We believe it's a trade agreement that has increased trade flows and investment flows between Mexico, Canada, and the United States, has created jobs. Over 15 million jobs in the US alone depend on trade with its North American partners. And as we have created within the North American region a level of integration of supply chains that was went way beyond expectations when the trade agreement was negotiated. We do believe, and we're coming into this discussion with an open mind, we do believe that NAFTA can be modernized. After all, it's a trade agreement that's 23 years old. So from the Mexican perspective, we see the potential of introducing pro-competitive disciplines that build on a free trade platform of 23 years that can add standards and principles that are needed for the proper operation of the 21st century economy. Many areas did not even exist in terms of disciplines back when the NAFTA was negotiated. So there's definitely something where we can advance the three countries together. We see NAFTA as a trilateral agreement where we can advance together. The position of Mexico is also clear with regards of what we do not want to see in a North American free trade agreement upgrade or modernization, which is any backtracking on the trade liberalization that we have had. So any increases in tariffs, quantitative restrictions, any rolling back of the benefits that we have obtained through trade liberalization would not be something that we would be inclined to support. At the same time, the big question here is how do we get to do this? So we believe that it is essential to work together, not just the governments of Canada, Mexico, but also the US society, private sector, on convincing decision makers in the US of the importance of NAFTA. And in the case of Mexico, to send the signal that the Mexican economy is essential to the US economic future, just as Mexico depends heavily on the US. And so the first step, I think, is that we need an honest assessment of the real impact of the NAFTA based on facts. And one of these facts I want to share with you is the fact that Mexico is a top customer of the US. We're not coming into this process as a country that just looks to extract concessions and access from the United States, where we are one of your top clients. And let me throw out some numbers out there. You know, the US exports 25% of all its corn exports go to Mexico. It's the #1 destination. That's $2.6 billion. We are the #1 market for electronic circuits coming from the United States, $2 billion. We are the #3 country that spends the most on tourism activities in the United States. Mexican nationals spent over $20 billion in the United States last year. And the United States has also, in addition to the benefits that I've mentioned before in terms of trade and employment, has an $11 billion surplus in services trade with Mexico. These are just a few examples of how we impact positively on the US economy. So we are encouraged by statements coming out of different sectors of the US, and we believe we need to do more, but encouraged by statements from the US Congress, from key legislators, from Texas, California, Arizona, talking about the importance of Mexico for the relationship with the United States. But it's not just the border states. When you look at states like Illinois, where 200,000 jobs depend on trade with Mexico, Pennsylvania, another 200,000 jobs depend on trade with Mexico, we see the reality of how we've impacted positively the US economy. You were talking about what lessons can we learn from other processes that we've been engaged with, for example, with TPP. Indeed, as I was mentioning, many of the disciplines that have been included or added to the TPP and where the 3 NAFTA countries negotiated did not exist back when the agreement was negotiated. So there's key areas there that look to facilitate trade, areas that are new, such as in the digital trade space, in IPR, expediting procedures on sanitary and phytosanitary measures. When you look at the importance of agricultural trade between Mexico, the US, and Canada, those are very beneficial and very welcome improvements. However, when we look at these areas, we also have to recognize that it is difficult, pretty much impossible, to simply think that we can extrapolate what was negotiated in the TPP and bring it completely as is into the North American context, because the outcomes of the TPP negotiation are the result of a balance of a negotiation between 12 countries. So there are things that would be different in the North American context, and there are things that we could add, things that if you look at the history, both in the cooperation, for example, between Mexico and the US, and the pro-competitive elements of border cooperation, infrastructure, regulatory cooperation, and other issues in the agenda that we've done bilaterally and trilaterally with our friends from Canada, those are pro-competitive elements that can be added to the discussion. And so, yes, in terms of TPP, even though the US right now has taken the decision to withdraw from the process, we are working actively on a strategy of diversification. We're looking to negotiate further with other regions in the world. We're enhancing our negotiations with Brazil, with Argentina, modernizing our trade agreement with the European Union, and in Asia Pacific, we're looking to work with the other members of the TPP to see how we can take this forward, either as a group of countries or bilaterally.
Just a quick question. You mentioned with respect to TPP, I believe, digital trade, SPS, and IPR. You didn't mention labor. Are you open to the improvements, considering the improvements made in TPP on labor in a bilateral context or a trilateral context?
Absolutely, and as I mentioned, the advantages of having done the work in TPP is that it showed how far many countries can go in upgrading the disciplines that they already have in other free trade agreements. And if you look at Mexico's history, where we were 30 years ago, specifically on issues of labor and environment, we have made great strides on the issue of protecting worker rights, on protecting the environment. We've taken a leadership role internationally on issues that have to do with the environment, such as our commitments on the Paris Agreement, for example. We've made great strides in labor reform and the protection of worker rights throughout this whole year. So this is an important element also of the message that Mexico is not the same country it was 30 years ago. And therefore, you see the disciplines in TPP on labor and environment that were the most advanced up to date. Maybe we can begin a discussion also in the North American context along those lines.
Thank you. Gilles, the same question to you. How does your government view renegotiation? I have to ask you, just given that your prime minister was here earlier this week, and I think there was a comment that Canada would only be expected to tweak the agreement, while more substantial changes would need to be made with respect to Mexico. If you could comment on that and maybe explain what Canada might be seeking in a renegotiation.
Well, thank you very much, Wendy, and I'm pleased to be here. I would start by saying I shared about almost all the points that Ken has made in respect to the NAFTA. From Canada's perspective, NAFTA has been a successful agreement. It was a landmark agreement at the time. It influenced trade policy making for a generation. It did have a significant impact on our economic flows, on the way things have evolved in our economy. Not only has trade expanded tremendously through the agreement, but also now we are more and more making things together. We have integrated the supply chain, and I think that reality is something that we absolutely want to continue to build on. At this early stage, it was important for my government to make sure that the information was properly communicated, that there was a genuine engagement to understand the extent of that relationship and how it is beneficial for not only for Canada but also for the United States. And that was one of the key objectives of the visit of the Prime Minister earlier this week was to underscore the importance of the relationship and how we can work together to make it even stronger. NAFTA is a trilateral agreement. It is a framework that we support entirely, and going forward, we continue to firmly believe that a vibrant trilateral framework is very important to preserve our economic interests. Of course, there are some stuff that are more dealt with in a bilateral fashion. In fact, the NAFTA does have lots of those things. If you look at the details of several of the annexes of the NAFTA, you do have some issues that are dealt with in a bilateral fashion, simply because it reflected the specific sectoral or interest at the time. So the fact that there'd be some discussion bilaterally does not take away the importance of preserving and building on a very vibrant trilateral NAFTA relationship. You mentioned, Wendy, the word tweaking. At first, when I heard it, I was wondering whether I was mishearing it, since I could confuse it with tweets. But
it's like twerks.
But at this point, we're very, very early in the process. So let's probably not be too get into too much of the specifics of what are Canada's interests or specific areas where we would seek some changes to the agreement. It's absolutely true that the agreement is over 20 years old. The economy has changed. We did, in fact, over the past 20 years, made some changes as well to the agreement. We had an interpretive note on Chapter 11 in the late early 2000. We made some changes to rule of origin to reflect commercial reality. We had, in fact, a package that was almost ready to go with the previous administration to improve some rules of origin. So there are things that NAFTA ought to be a living agreement, and we can envisage the process here as one that could result into improvement to better reflect today's reality. And as you know, over the past several years, we've been embarked on many other trade policy initiatives, whether it is the TPP, where a lot of new elements were brought to the fore. So yes, it's quite legitimate at this point, to take a look at that and to see what could be applicable in a NAFTA context. Always with the mindset of trying to make sure that anything we do is to strengthen the relationship, to build on all the open markets that we think has been a success story. Canada just completed, and yesterday the European Parliament voted on our agreement with Europe. This is an immense milestone for Canada, having access to the big European market. So there are policy innovations that we did in that context that also could be quite relevant in a NAFTA renegotiating process. The government has also signaled interest in developing what we call a progressive trade agenda, meaning by that there is a recognition that perhaps we haven't done as good a job as we ought to explain the benefit of trade, and sometimes the benefit of trade are not very well articulated, and the adverse impact might be concentrated. So we need to make sure that there is consideration for the potential adverse impact that trade liberalization could bring. Issues that relate to labor, environment, the right to regulate, preserving health and safety. These are things that any government would need to make sure that one policy stream on the trade side does not run afoul of objectives that are legitimate on these other policy objectives. So how you can bring the two together, maybe that's another area where we could look in terms of a NAFTA process. So all of that, you need to look at the current context, be informed by whatever other policy initiatives that are in play, and how you can bring that to a negotiating context in the NAFTA. As long as I think we all share the objective, and I think that's certainly a message that came out quite well with the visit of the Prime Minister on Monday. The United States and Canada certainly made clear that what we want to do is to strengthen the relationship, to build on, to make things better for both of our countries. And I think that's ought to be the starting point of any process to improve the NAFTA.
Thank you. Chip, maybe I can turn to you. One area that's been discussed as a possible renegotiation priority for the administration is the area of rules of origin. And having negotiated some rules of origin issues in TPP, my experience is those are extremely complex negotiations. I was wondering if you can give us some flavor of the rule of origin issue in NAFTA. I mean, you negotiated NAFTA 23 years ago, and your views on prospects for strengthening these rules or updating the rules of origin.
Sure. First, thanks for having me here. I never expected 23 years ago that we would be having this kind of a meeting again, but and I retired, I should say, as will become clear in my remarks. I retired 3 years ago, and this is one of the, I think this is the second time I've had a chance to speak on these issues in which I'm neither having to worry about speaking for the U.S. government nor avoiding offending any client or prospective client. So that's quite liberating. On the
Go for it.
yeah, don't tell me that. Rules of origin, which before anybody goes to sleep or heads for the exit, but if you're not familiar with them, in a free trade area, each country in the free trade area keeps its trade regime vis-a-vis all the other countries in the world. So Mexico, Canada, and the United States did not agree to have identical trade regimes vis-a-vis the rest of the world, but you want to have the benefits, then just go to products of the three countries. And that's easy when it's wheat, and wheat is grown in one country, and so forth and so on. But you get something like an automobile, which is made out of parts from all over the place. So what constitutes an automobile that we will consider to originate in the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and therefore get the tariff preference that is given? And the tariff preference is you get zero duty treatment, and instead of the most favored nation tariff, which now on average is about 2 or 3%, I think, for the United States, probably more like 5 or something like that for Mexico. Anyway, so the parties then define, the big negotiating issue is, okay, so how much has to happen in our three countries for it to count as a North American product and therefore get this preferential treatment? It is not the rule for what every manufacturer has to do. I mean, I can't remember the exact number, but the automobiles, it's either 62.5% or something like that. God, we fought over that. But it's not that every car that is built in North America has to have 62.5% content that is Mexican, Canadian, or US. It's that if it's going to get a tariff preference, it has to have that. So the interesting exercise when you're doing this with products like cars and products like computers and so forth is, okay, so how much content can we require? It sounds like it'd be a great idea to say, oh, let's have 100% content, no free riding if it's got so much as a Korean spark plug. Do they have spark plugs anymore? It doesn't count. But bear in mind that the most favored nation trade tariff is like 2 or 3%. You can only force companies to build so much stuff that you don't do very competitively in North America before they just say, oh, well, actually, I'm not going to make it here at all. I'll make it in Japan and import the whole doggone thing, and I won't have to worry about all your crazy rules and how much I've got of this, that, and the other thing. And I do, it's sort of still seared in my memory that we were going to have in a 50% content rule for computers. And this was going to be, we were very proud of ourselves, and by gum, this was going to be a huge help and so forth. So we went to meet with the computer industry about this, and they said, well, that's very nice for you, but I will tell you that will not be a single computer built in North America anywhere that will meet a 50% rule. So you will have a very intricate rule in which you can congratulate yourself and ask everybody in the Congress to congratulate you for it, but you won't have induced anybody to build anything in the US. Now, if you make it more reasonable, we might build it here because it might be worthwhile to build it here And if there's a, there was, I can't remember, 3 or 4% tariff at the time. But there's just limits to what you can do with rules of origin. And one of the few things that Congress was generous about in negotiating authority was they did actually allow the U.S. government to negotiate revised rules of origin and not require congressional approval of the result, except, of course, in textiles, where the rules of origin were designed to assure that hardly anything was made in the United States. But that wasn't the way we thought of it. It was, you just couldn't touch it because it was too politically sensitive. So, I mean, modernizing the rules of origin would be certainly one of the things that would make a lot of sense, because, of course, even the process by which things are made now is not the same, what would be the best rule for encouraging activity in North America just has probably changed on a lot of products. One other interesting anecdote: when the United States did a free trade agreement with Central America, the rules of origin there, just sort of a anecdotal proof of the extent of the integration of Canada, the United States, and Mexico. The rules of origin for the U.S. agreements with Central America, to which Mexico and Canada are not parties, nevertheless count Mexican and Canadian content as being Central America or Central America U.S. content. So apologize for for getting so deep into the weeds, but it's this is a subject that is very important for industries and very illustrative of the degree of interdependence.
Another issue that comes up a lot in the context when people talk about NAFTA now is the border tax and border adjustment tax, and I think sometimes they're used interchangeably. And I was wondering if you could kind of shed some light on what these ideas are, and how they could be addressed in the NAFTA negotiation, or more broadly, and frankly, what are the implications in terms of our WTO obligations and other trade obligations?
Well, there's been a lot of, first of all, it's an honor to be up here with Ken and Gilles, and especially Wendy, who we started at USTR around the same time, and Chip, who helped teach me GATT law. When the first time I sat in the USTR staff meeting, I remember thinking, boy, this is a real lot of gobbledygook, but I've managed to persist. And, on border adjustment, there are provisions in the GATT and the WTO that allow adjustments on importation and on exportation of indirect taxes. And so what the House is talking about under the Speaker's Better Way proposal is to try and slot a border adjustment system into U.S. tax law. It's not clear that it's WTO consistent because, at least as I read A Better Way, it looks like it's more of a rejiggering of U.S. corporate income taxes, which are direct taxes and therefore not eligible for adjustment, as opposed to an indirect tax on like a VAT or a sales tax. In fact, A Better Way is quite emphatic that it's not a VAT or a sales tax, would be basically dead on arrival in the Republican caucus. What President Trump has talked about is a border tax, and what he seems to be talking about is more of an import tax that would be imposed on goods coming from Mexico or on U.S. companies that relocate production facilities down to Mexico. He may have, probably does have, I think, some authority under things like Section 301 to impose an import tax on goods. He would probably have to go back to Congress for authority for a tax on a corporate entity, because Congress has never delegated that authority to the president for entirely sound reasons. So what they're talking about, I think, are very different things. There's some possibility that they could merge together. That does happen in politics, and everyone could join as one happy Republican family around some concept, but they're very different. And so far, the White House has expressed some skepticism about border adjustability, and for its part, Speaker Ryan and Chairman Brady on the Ways and Means Committee have expressed some skepticism about an import tax. So right now, they're not quite on the same page.
Thank you. I was glad to hear from our panelists that think they all agree that there are things that can be done to update NAFTA, to modernize NAFTA, and particularly from my Canadian-Mexican colleagues, kind of a willingness to engage with the United States on such a renegotiation. However, I thought it'd be good for this panel just to touch briefly on the issue of what happens and how would it work if the U.S. decided that the renegotiation was not working, that the U.S. objectives could not be achieved, and therefore the U.S. would choose to withdraw from NAFTA. There are legal requirements in the agreement, and maybe I can turn to Warren briefly to share with us how this would happen.
Well, there are different views on this, including within my own law firm, and what I'm going to say right now is just a personal view. But under NAFTA and every other trade agreement that the United States has entered into, there's a withdrawal clause. In NAFTA, the president would have to give notice to Mexico and Canada that he plans to withdraw in 6 months. Then under Section 125 of the Trade Act of 1974, which has been incorporated in every renewal of trade promotion authority, including the one that was used to negotiate NAFTA and the Uruguay round, the president has authority, I believe, to withdraw from trade agreements and also to proclaim higher tariffs up to 50% above our column 2 rate, which would be basically the Smoot-Hawley rate. So you're talking about a very high tariff. The more probably likely outcome would be that it would just revert to our MFN tariff. So we just apply the same tariffs to Canada and Mexico that we apply to other WTO trading partners. There are a couple of little kickers out there that Chip and my former deputy, Ken Freiberg, slipped into the NAFTA and Canada Implementing Acts. First of all, the Canada agreement is only suspended, so Canada would kick back into effect if NAFTA is terminated. The other thing, and this—
You mean the bilateral?
The bilateral U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement. So Canada would lose some of the benefits of NAFTA, but it would retain other things that were in the Canada agreement, which is one of the foundations for the NAFTA. The other thing, and this predates all of us, is when they drafted Section 125, Congress, for legitimate reasons, was concerned about what would be the impact of a large jump in U.S. tariffs. So any tariff increase would be phased in a year after the U.S. withdraws. The president can move that up in extreme circumstances, but the normal expectation would be there would be a lag period before the tariffs would go up to the MFN rate or the Smoot-Hawley rate or whatever rate is decided. But I think the president has authority to do this if he wants to. The assumption being at the time that in the Congress that you would never have a president who would be crazy enough to do this sort of thing. So the problem was not tying his hands, it was giving him the authority to do what needed to be done.
Just a quick question. If the U.S. were to notify Canada and Mexico that it wanted to withdraw from NAFTA, but it changed its mind within that 6-month period, or everyone's able to go back to the table and to achieve a win-win outcome, is that okay? Or once you notify, are you committed then to withdrawing at the 6-month juncture?
Well, the Lisbon Treaty for the EU is something where once you notify it, you need a waiver from the rest of the EU countries to withdraw. But NAFTA, I think there would have to be a further decision by the United States to issue a notice of withdrawal at the end of the 6-month period. So you could work something out during that period if you wanted to put a gun to your head.
You could take 5 years if you want to.
Sure.
Because there's nothing, and it's a unilateral decision. It doesn't require the consent of the other two parties. So
Gilles wasn't looking too happy when you said 5 years. Ken,
You
maybe,
don't know what's available after 6 months, Gilles. It might look like you have 5 years.
Ken, you had mentioned in your remarks that Mexico now is looking to diversify its trading partners. A lot of its trade is concentrated with the U.S. You joined TPP, obviously, and I've noted lately that you're reaching out to Malaysia and to other countries. And I was wondering if you can just share with us some of Mexico's thinking on this. And I also understand there'll be a meeting in Chile next month where Chile has invited the other TPP ministers to come to Santiago and to discuss how to proceed on TPP without the United States. And I understand Mexico will be at that meeting. So anything you can share with us on what Mexico's plans are now with respect to strengthening ties with other countries in the Asia-Pacific region.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, as we prepare for this dialogue with the U.S. and Canada on the NAFTA, we have launched our own process domestically of consultation with our private sector, with our society. It's a 90-day consultation period where we hope to gather information as to what elements could be part of a Mexican proposal to bring to the table once we know what the U.S. is thinking of. Let's not forget that it is the United States that is the demandeur in this process. They have brought or will bring at some point the request to renegotiate. So we're doing our own work domestically to look at different scenarios. One scenario, of course, is obtaining information from our private sector, having our own proposal ready when the time comes, and preparing for different possibilities. Of course, the one that is ideal would be, as I mentioned at the beginning, to have pro-competitive disciplines injected into the process of the NAFTA, building on this free trade platform and moving forward on a more competitive North American agenda. But we have to look at all the different scenarios, including the one that involves preparing for life after NAFTA. As you were mentioning, in the case that the United States unilaterally chooses to leave the NAFTA, then we cannot afford to just wait to see what happens the day that takes place. So what we are working on is, in parallel with preparing for this discussion with the United States and consulting with our civil society and private sectors, is accelerating the pace of our process of diversification. That is why with regions where now there is more of a willingness to engage fully in a discussion on trade liberalization, we're advancing as we hadn't done before with Brazil, with Argentina, as I mentioned. It is very important to take into consideration the work we've done within the Pacific Alliance, because 3 of the 4 members of the Pacific Alliance were also members of the TPP. So here's where we see how we can try to continue working within the alliance, which liberates trade fully. That is the objective that we have signed and that we are advancing fully on that. But it also helps us to create a high level of integration with the rest of our Latin American partners that hadn't been done ever really, and that we can use to build bridges also with Asia Pacific. Because just as I mentioned that for us, it is a priority to advance in the direction of liberalizing trade between Mexico and Asia Pacific. We know that Peru, Chile, and also Colombia are very interested in doing so. So we are preparing for this scenario where we may not have a NAFTA. Like I said, it is not the ideal scenario or a scenario that we would pursue. We have looked at different possibilities of what would happen if the U.S. withdraws. We had a situation in our agreement known as the G3, that was Colombia, Mexico, and Venezuela, where Venezuela denounced the agreement and pulled out, but we still retained the agreement between Mexico and Colombia. So we believe that there would be a similar situation if the U.S. were to pull out. Mexico and Canada would continue to have a free trade agreement if our partners to the north agree, of course.
You agree?
And so,
Of course. Of course.
And so at the same time, however, it is important that we've been concentrating a lot on the legal and the economic aspects of this discussion, of this dialogue within North America. But there's political considerations as well. And the talk in the United States for the last year and a half, anti-trade, and to a certain degree anti-Mexico, has also revived a lot of nationalist positions in our own country that look to revive the arguments against opening the economy. Let's not forget that Mexico became one of the most open economies in the world, but we used to be one of the most closed economies in the world. So we have political forces in Mexico that are calling for taking advantage of this quote-unquote opportunity to pull out of the NAFTA, to close agricultural access into Mexico, not just from the U.S., but from all countries, talk about returning to import substitution, to self-sufficiency in food production, concepts that we had managed to do away with, at least politically, for the last couple of decades, and that are coming down to the forefront. We also have elections in the summer of 2018, which poses a challenge as well. So we hope that we can advance in this process where cooler heads prevail in the 3 North American countries, where we're able to reach a deal that strengthens the NAFTA, that does not roll it back, and much less eliminate it. But we do have to face those political realities. There's initiatives being presented by senators from the opposition parties in Mexico calling for having expedited agreements with, for example, Brazil and Argentina to buy agricultural products and to close the access from the US. We as a government do not want to see a situation where we close down access from our #1 partner because we know what impact it would have on us, but these are some of the key realities that we're facing. So we're trying to, at the same time, diversify and strengthen our dialogue with the United States and Canada.
Gilles, just a quick question for you before we turn to the audience for their questions. And that is, you had mentioned what the positive development this week with respect to your FTA with the EU, CETA, and that moving forward now in Europe. I noted, I believe it was last summer, that Canada now has embarked on at least a study phase, or exploratory phase, with respect to an FTA with China. Where does that stand, and is that a genuine prospect?
Thanks, Wendy. Yes, indeed. The government is committed to try to find ways to open up new market opportunities for our exporter, and we are well in our phase of exploratory talks with China. Another round of exploratory discussion is scheduled for next week in Beijing. We've had, we did a consultative process domestically, lots of good input. So this is an initiative that now is advancing. We're not yet at the stage of formally announcing the launch of negotiation, but the process is moving along. So there is a commitment, and so far the Chinese government has been very forthcoming. They are clearly interested in upping and moving to a negotiating phase.
Okay, I'd like to turn to the audience. So what I'd like to do is to just take a few questions, and one after the other. I would ask people first to introduce yourselves and to keep your questions as short as possible, just one question per person. And then we'll try and move this along so we can get as many questions in over the next 10 or 15 minutes. Sir?
Sean Mulvaney with Procter & Gamble. Question for you. What would require an implementing bill for Congress as relates to changes to NAFTA? Rules of origin, TPP chapters that weren't there. How do you see Congress's role maybe with Trade Promotion Authority having to be invoked versus maybe a tweaking?
Any other questions?
Hi, Doug Palmer with Politico. I guess my question has to do about manufacturing, since that seems to be a particular focus of President Trump. Is it possible to renegotiate NAFTA in a way that brings back manufacturing jobs to the United States? And does that mean taking manufacturing jobs away from Canada and Mexico?
Thank you. David Short with FedEx. If I could direct a question to Ken Smith Ramos. I believe that on Monday when Prime Minister Trudeau was here, President Trump drew a distinction between Canada and Mexico because the trade balance with Canada is the deficit is much less. And I think he referred to a figure north of 60 billion as the trade deficit. Does Mexico accept that level of trade deficit is not sustainable, and that some of the changes, you said you don't want NAFTA to be amended to include tariffs or to include managed trade quotas, that sort of thing. What are Mexico's ideas for responding to the President Trump's concern about the size of the trade deficit?
Thanks. So we have 3 questions. One, wanting to understand what the U.S. would have to put in an implementing bill to gain congressional approval for a renegotiation of NAFTA. Doug had asked the question of bringing jobs back to the United States under a NAFTA renegotiation. And then the whole issue that we're hearing about, that maybe these free trade negotiations in this administration are going to focus on trying to somehow balance our trade deficits with certain trading partners. So who would like to be first to address any of these issues? Warren?
Certainly, if the administration is planning to do significant changes to a renegotiated NAFTA, it probably needs to proceed under Trade Promotion Authority, and there's some very specific procedures. You would have to notify the Congress and consult for a minimum of 90 days. Then there's some procedures on how you put up draft implementing legislation. But the most important requirement is that the president consult throughout with the Congress. And this isn't just sort of a nuisance requirement. Ultimately, these things have to pass the Congress if they're going to go into law. And that means that it's partly a legal issue of complying with certain procedures, but in the end, it's a political issue of whether you have the votes. And, I would say that this presents some potentially daunting political challenges. I mean, it's clear that President Trump needs to do something given the importance of his trade message to how he won the election. But he also has certain constituencies out there that are going to be opposed to anything that leads to the termination of NAFTA or that rejiggers it in a way that they lose access. And you'd have to point particularly to sectors like agriculture, which has benefited hugely from NAFTA and a doubling of U.S. exports to places like Mexico. Mexico and Canada are our first and third largest farm export markets. The other one you'd have to say is things like heavy manufacturing. In the auto sector, we may run deficits in motor vehicles, but what we import from Mexico, by and large, not exclusively, is smaller cars that otherwise might be imported from Korea or Japan. And what we export is trucks, which are just as popular, I think, in Mexico and a lot of Latin America as they are here. Those trucks are made in places like Ohio, Michigan, Indiana. And so you could find some Trump voters who thought renegotiating NAFTA would be good, who are collecting unemployment if this thing leads to restrictions or at the end of NAFTA or restrictions on motor vehicle trade. So they've got to thread the needle. They probably will not get a huge amount of support, I would think, from Democrats. It's possible, I suppose, if you put in new chapters on the environment or change the rules of origin and stuff like that. But I think a lot of Democrats are going to say, well, we don't like the renegotiated enhanced NAFTA any more than we like the old NAFTA. And by the way, this is our chance to get back those Trump voters. So, at the end, you could be trying to, again, get it through with just mostly Republican votes, like most recent trade bills. That's going to require a lot of political capital. And more than that, you're going to have problems with some Republican constituencies who would be big losers out of this, particularly all those rural areas that voted for Trump.
Ken?
Thank you very much. I'd like to address David's and Doug's question together because I think they are related. And I think it is very important to understand and to transmit to all stakeholders in the U.S. as well that the trade balance is not a correct measure to measure the success of a free trade agreement. And especially today in a globalized economy where products go back and forth across borders many times and you import from many regions of the world in order to enhance the competitiveness of your final products, but also to provide goods and services in a good variety and at good prices for your own consumers. So this notion that if you invest in Mexico, it's a minus for the U.S. and vice versa. If you invest in the U.S., it's a minus for other regions of the world, no longer applies, if it ever did, to a globalized economy. So in the case of the North American Free Trade Agreement, like I said, trade is not a zero-sum game. And if you look specifically at the impact on manufacturing jobs over the years, yes, at the beginning of the decade, if you look at the last 10, 12 years, there was a decline in manufacturing jobs in the United States. But studies have demonstrated that 87% of that job loss has nothing to do with trade. It has to do with increases in productivity, automation, new technologies coming in and not impacting jobs because of trade. Rather, trade is part of the solution. And that's where we have to turn the paradigm around. One example, if you look at the sectors, the industrial sectors in the US that are closely linked to Mexico in their production, in the division of labor and production capabilities across borders, integrated industrial clusters, their contribution to manufacturing GDP has been higher in the United States than sectors that are not linked to Mexico. So sectors that are not linked to trade have done worse than those that are linked to trade. The example is in the automotive sector. Their contribution to manufacturing GDP went up 64%, where on average, industrial contribution to GDP in general was 38%. So you see a strong impact on the positive side in terms of job creation and opportunities in a globalized economy from enhancing free trade and not rolling it back.
Briefly, on this question of manufacturing job or job more generally, I think it's the objective of any government to stimulate their economy to create jobs. And when you look at at trade, you're looking to do that in every instances. And I want to go back to one point about the rule of origin aspect here, which is quite significant. And indeed, in NAFTA, only the auto sector has a value threshold. All the rest is a tariff shift. Why? Because it's a lot easier for companies to adjust with a tariff shift, because it's a lot easier for a custom procedure standpoint. And this is quite important for small business in particular. You need to have a process whereby you can avail yourself of the preferences in a reasonably cost-effective way from an administrative standpoint. So you need to have rules that are easy to implement. And I think that could be a very powerful message, because when we look at our trade, there's a lot of trade that goes with the larger companies. But by far, the job creation comes from smaller companies. So you need to make, and when you look at the North America context, for Canada, the US, and Mexico, it's almost the same. The vast majority of our small companies, the first foreign markets they penetrate, it's your neighbor market. So you need to make sure that your rules will be trade facilitating from that standpoint. And some of the initiatives that we want to continue to develop with the United States and eventually with Mexico is to facilitate this paper process at the border. All our efforts on pre-clearance and eventually to pre-clearance cargo that was referred to in the statement by the Prime Minister on Monday, these are aimed at helping small companies to better export their product to the foreign country, and that way you create a lot of jobs.
Just in order on the, I basically agree with Warren on the negotiating authority. Anything you do that requires a change in U.S. law, it's normally easier to get. If anything that was agreed that would require a change in U.S. law, it's normally easier to get it with what we used to call fast track, or they now call TPA, and that involves all these processes. I must say, as a veteran of NAFTA, we spent a year and a half consulting with the private sector. We probably had 40 meetings like this before we ever launched negotiations. We talked to every industry. I actually find myself, I've got a couple of people here who worked with me on NAFTA. I'm sort of astonished that we could be talking about flipping off NAFTA or giving 90 days notice, and then I guess a week later we wrap up the negotiation. It astonishes me, frankly, that the private sector is not saying a thing. Now, maybe they're all terrified that they're going to be the ones threatened with 35% duties and so forth. And on the question whether you could do anything about the manufacturing trade deficit, of course you can't. Mexico and Canada are not going to agree that, okay, we're going to have a bilateral balance, okay? So which of the Americans, what should we have? A bunch of GS-15s in the Commerce Department deciding who has to stop trading so that we can get this balance? I mean, it's ridiculous. frankly, the administration desperately needs some real economists inside them because they're just proposing things that we can't do in a system that still has some vestige of capitalism about it. Just for example.
And if I can just add on, the point about how the current TPA provides for that 90-day notification to Congress before negotiations can commence, I'm reminded by when Japan, Canada, Mexico joined the TPP in a similar provision, we followed a similar provision, and basically, at least with Japan, we spent about a year and a half talking to them before we even notified Congress during that 90-day period. And I believe for Canada, Mexico, a little shorter, maybe a year, 6 months a year. We had extensive pre-consultations with those three trading partners, but also, frankly, with Congress and our stakeholders. If I can just conclude this panel with one quick question, and I wanted to kind of take the summary from the Economist. And the Economist outlined 3 possible outcomes for NAFTA and the NAFTA renegotiation. 1 is that we tear it up. 2 is that the United States bullies its trading partners into making concessions. Or 3, we go for a renegotiation that benefits all 3. And so I want to ask each panelist how they see this playing out. I'm going to start as the optimist. And I really believe that we will end up with a renegotiation that will benefit all 3 countries, because after all 3 countries have to go home and to sell these deals to their domestic constituencies and their legislatures. Ken.
Thank you very much. I'll bring out the crystal ball and take a gamble on this. I think at the end of the day, we will be able to strengthen the NAFTA if, and only if, everybody works actively on this. This is not going to happen automatically. I think there's a lot of forces that have been pushing in the other direction, like I said, not just in the United States, but also in Mexico, and I imagine some voices in Canada as well. So we need to have full involvement by everybody who has a stake in this game in order to make that happen, so that we can actually have, at the end of the day, a strengthened NAFTA.
Warren.
Well, I actually would share Ken's and your optimism. I think in the end, it's really not in the president's political interest to terminate NAFTA. I think realistically, the only way you get to an agreement is something that's a win-win, probably something that involves potentially some limited changes to NAFTA. But that also means that you have the mother of all trade votes coming up to try and get it through our Congress 2 to 4 years from now. So, this is just the start of a long, long process.
Yeah.
Your third scenario is the one that certainly we're determined to work on. And based on the Monday's meeting, we're confident that this is also shared by our U.S. partners.
Chip, unplugged.
Yeah. I actually come out on the optimistic side, primarily because the administration is going to discover that they can't really do anything that actually helps the constituents they're trying to help. It doesn't help U.S. workers. The only way you could bring, the lessons of the last couple of decades would certainly say the only way you can really reduce that old trade deficit is to run a good recession. And it just doesn't work. Now, one thing that would be very nice is if they would work on worker adjustment assistance, and not just worker adjustment assistance to those who think they can connect their job loss to trade, but the numbers are really kind of overwhelming. We manufacture, the value of U.S. manufacturing is way up in the last 25 years, and employment is way down. And it's not trade; it's that there are machines. It takes a fifth the number of steel workers to make a ton of steel that it did 25 years ago, or something like that. And those people all need assistance in finding jobs. That's going to be the big challenge for the next 20 years.
Well, thank you, and thanks to all the panelists. So we can have a round of applause for this panel.
Thank you.